Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight for this public event from the Psychedelic Experience Clinic. We are recording, so please keep yourselves muted. There will be opportunity for questions and discussion. It's probably going to be quite interactive tonight, so please feel free to chime in when there's opportunity for that. We're very pleased tonight to be joined by Nathan Gorelick for his talk, Psychedelics and the Science of Mysticism. Nathan is a term assistant professor of English at Barnard College at Columbia University in the city of New York, and a candidate in the postgraduate program at Pulsion, the International Institute of Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychosomatics. His first book, The Unwritten Enlightenment, details the literary history of the unconscious from the 18th century to the present. His next book examines the forgotten history of psychedelics in the Freudian field and what its recovery means for psychoanalysis today. He's an award-winning teacher and a widely published author whose works appear in magazines and journals including Praxis, Psychoanalytic Review, Continental Thought and Theory, and the International Journal of Counseling Psychology, and in numerous essay collections on psychoanalysis, philosophy, and contemporary cultural criticism. Thank you very much, Nathan. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Timmy, and for the invitation to be here, for all of you for attending, and to the Psychedelic Experience Clinic, not only for inviting me to be a part of this series, but for the series as a whole. I'm going to speak to you today about some of my current research on the history and possible future of the relation between psychoanalysis and psychedelics. And I want to begin somewhat awkwardly by begging your indulgence here, since I have no way of knowing just who my audience is and how familiar you may or may not be with some of what I'll be discussing. For some of you, this may be old news. For others, it will be totally new. But my goal today really is not to educate you. What I really want to do is tell you a story that I hope can frame a larger and I think increasingly urgent and important conversation about what psychoanalysis in particular, maybe psychology in general, can contribute to the question of mystical experience under the influence of psychedelics. Now, this is not a new problem, but it has taken on new stakes in light of what, for better and for worse, has come to be called the psychedelic renaissance. So as I walk us through this story, I hope you will be listening for what else needs to be said that I haven't said, that maybe I'm saying wrong, that you'll be developing your own questions, crafting your own objections to my versions of things. And as Timmy already suggested, I would be happy for you to interrupt at any point in this story with any of those questions or objections. Or if you want to wait until I'm done saying my piece, there will be plenty of time, I hope, for us to engage with one another, for me to hear some of the questions that you have brought here or that occurred to you along the way. And above all, to consider with me what all this might mean for the practice of psychoanalysis today. So I'm going to begin a slideshow presentation here. And you'll have to forgive me, I am not an expert in graphic design, but there you have it. So I want to tell you a very short version of a very long story. And it is the history of our own, and I think our own apparently novel moment in which psychoanalysis and psychedelics are once again coming together in the clinic. They came together rather explosively during the first wave of psychedelics research, scientific and therapeutic, in the 1950s and 1960s. After Prohibition in the late 1960s and early 70s, that relationship quickly dissolved and turned today into one, I think, widely of antagonism. It's fair to say, I believe, that a lot of psychoanalysts or psychoanalysis in general exhibit something of an allergy to mysticism, to psychedelics, to drugs of any kind, and there are good reasons for that. But I want to know, where this allergy came from, whether it's necessary and essential or merely sort of accident of our history, and how it might be rethought. So the history that I'm telling you, this short story of a much longer story, is a clinical history of, in general, medically induced altered states of consciousness and the therapeutic value of a kind of controlled mysticism and mystical experience. Now, the fact that there was ever a relationship between psychedelics and the mystical experience they can induce on one hand, and psychoanalysis on the other hand, this is already sort of extraordinary. Since from the beginning, as many of you will know, psychoanalysis was at immense pains to distinguish itself from mysticism. From drugs, maybe not so much. I mean, there's an important moment right in the middle of the interpretation of dreams in which Freud notes that the dream of Irma's injection, the story of his own discovery of the unconscious through his own experience, was in many ways a cocaine-induced experience. But mysticism is something else. And in this allergy to mysticism, or this attempt rigorously to distinguish what it has to offer from mysticism, psychoanalysis is part of a longer tradition in psychology, psychiatry, and science more generally to define itself, to constitute itself against mysticism. So, in order to get into this, let me begin with a few framing questions to just organize our thinking together. A first question you must be asking yourself is, what does that mean? What is mysticism? And since we're speaking about the science of mysticism, well, what is science? How do psychedelics illuminate and complicate the distinctions between them? Illuminate as in draw the line between mysticism and science more brightly, and complicate in terms of also muddying the waters somewhat. And can mysticism itself be scientific? In other words, when we speak of the science of mysticism, can we speak of a kind of scientific mysticism? Or is it only a possible object of scientific inquiry? So the science of mysticism, like the science of biology or the science of geology. Life as an object of scientific inquiry, the earth as an object of scientific inquiry, mysticism as an object of scientific inquiry. Can mysticism, in a way, or even in a very scientific way, claim a certain scientific authority, and what would be the value of that sort of a claim? And as I've already mentioned, the horizon of all of this is the question, what does any of this, pardon the typo, matter for psychoanalytic praxis? So the shorter version of the longer story is that when we are asking what is mysticism, since, as I've just said, we're looking at the history of science as a history of differentiating itself from mysticism, of constituting itself as something other and opposed to mysticism. When we're asking what is mysticism, we are also asking at the same time, what is science? Because it is, in fact, only from within a scientific worldview that something like mysticism as a unified object can come together. I mean, if we gather the immense variety and diversity of spiritual or religious practices together under the heading of mysticism, and in so doing erase the vast array of distinctions between them, we can only do so by saying that it is not science, that mysticism is everything in essence that science is not. So this notion of a unified object called mysticism already is a scientific formulation, and we would do well, therefore, to consider what science thinks it is or what it thinks it is doing by introducing that differentiation. So as we will see, I think that when we begin to answer the question, what is mysticism, we can provide three provisional responses. First, that mysticism is the other of science, maybe not the only other of science, but a particularly important other to science against which it opposes and defines itself. And that mysticism has a unique importance as this other and defining opposition to the science of the mind. So not just science as in biology and geology, but the science of the mind itself, however that might be termed. And third, that this particular science, the science of the mind, is rooted in clinical experience and is in fact built out of clinical experience. It is in engagements with patients in a medical or therapeutic setting or environment that the science called psychology and eventually psychoanalysis develops. So as a brief parenthesis, I want to suggest that when we're talking about the science of the mind, we are not talking about the brain. When we speak about the mind, we speak about subjectivity, the particularity and uniqueness of a kind of mental experience as it belongs to a particular and unique person. Whereas the brain is your brain, my brain, and any other brain as a kind of object in a laboratory. So neurology, neurobiology, neurophysiology is less interested, I think almost not at all interested in experience, in subjective experience, since it really defines itself, since it organizes itself around only what can be measured and observed and generalized. Whereas, and I'll return to this later, I think it's fair to define psychoanalysis within the larger rubric of that science of the mind as the science of subjectivity. All right, now let's jump into some of the origins of this problematic. And we'll begin with the initial division between science and the science of the mind and what will come to be understood as mysticism at the end of the 18th century with this enigmatic, esoteric, and charismatic figure, Franz Anton Mesmer, the namesake for mesmerism, which very quickly became synonymous with animal magnetism. The idea being, at least from Mesmer originally, and this is at the end of the 18th century, at the peak of that period we now know as the Enlightenment, when a scientific materialist way of understanding the universe was quickly displacing an older religious cosmology, a religious way of understanding the universe. Mesmer, like a lot of other scientific minds of the time, or purportedly scientific minds at least, believed that there was some kind of a superfine, invisible fluid connecting all matter in the universe, and that in a living organism like a human being, this fluid could become imbalanced, and that imbalance was the cause of any illness, whether it be mental, physical, and even the distinction between mentality and physicality is different in the 18th century than we think of it today. So that by manipulating this superfine fluid through this this thing called animal magnetism, which builds on that same late 18th century discovery of electromagnetism, that fluid could be drawn back into its balance, and the ailment to which anybody was suffering would evaporate. Now, this angered a lot of the emergent scientific minds of the time. They couldn't argue with Mesmer's results. It seemed that his cure really did work, and very quickly after moving from Vienna to Paris, he became the toast of the town. So the scientific establishment, such as it was in the middle of the 1780s, convened a couple of um, uh, I don't know, review boards to try to prove or disprove the foundations of Mesmer's theory. And it was because of this effort to disprove Mesmer that that ethereal concept of the cosmos was ultimately disproved. These tests also provided the historical foundation for what would become control studies involving human test subjects, which are even today the gold standard of clinical psychopharmacological research. So Mesmer distinguished himself, or wanted to distinguish himself, even though today it seems like quackery and pseudoscience, from the older prevalent model of faith healing, which also involved intervening through speech, through a certain will on the part of both the practitioner and the patient to get better, that yielded results without any sort of scientific foundation. So Mesmer represents really, even as I say, even though he's not considered very scientific today, this moment of cut where the science of the mind begins to distinguish itself as science and to distance itself from mysticism. The next step on our journey, and again, this is a short, abridged version of a very long story, takes us to the middle of the following century to Jean-Jacques Moreau, Dr. Moreau de Tours, the original Dr. Moreau, whose book on hash and mental illness in 1845 introduced drugs as a means to both understanding and treating mental ailments. Now, Moreau de Tours, interestingly, smoked a lot of hash himself, or dissolved it in tea, as did some of the other more artistically inclined minds of the time, and believed that based on the development of the series of effects that the drug would have on him, that he was simulating the experience of madness itself. So as you get a little more high, you get a little more mad. And he understood this sort of as a controlled laboratory experiment in madness that allowed him better to understand that ailment. But he also thought that administered in the right doses, that hashish, concentrated cannabis, could have profoundly curative effects. So he writes in this book, for example, one of the effects of hashish that struck me most forcefully, and which generally gets the most attention, is that manic excitement always accompanied by a feeling of gaiety and joy inconceivable to those who have never experienced it. This is already, to underline this point, an emphasis on the impossibility of communicating the experience of intoxication unless one has oneself also been similarly intoxicated by that same substance. We see this again and again in trip reports from the early 20th century all the way up to the present. I saw in it, he continues, a mean of effectively combating the fixed ideas of depressives, disrupting the chain of their ideas, of unfocusing their attention on such and such a subject. And this, even in its very language, resonates profoundly with some mid-20th century psychoanalytic papers on the profound value that something like LSD will have in breaking otherwise unreachable patients who have proved completely intransigent to psychoanalysis. Well, sort of breaking into that fixity, and as one report suggests, getting 10 years of psychoanalysis done in just a couple of weeks. So you have this kind of miracle cure, panacea, drugs are the solution to all of our problems idea already in the middle of the 19th century. Now, I say that this is an important moment in the history of distinguishing science from mysticism because Moreau de Tours is clear in saying that he is himself not mad when he is intoxicated. He simply understands what madness might be like for somebody else. So the division between the doctor, the practitioner, the therapist, and the subject who would be treated by that doctor is drawn even more insistently, precisely via his use of these drugs. We'll jump ahead even further to the end of the 19th century when Havelock Ellis, a contemporary of Freud's, in a weird, lovely little article called Mescal, A New Artificial Paradise, reports on his own experience trying the peyote cactus and experiencing what he there calls a saturnalia of the senses, though he decides eventually, having taken this substance from some of the indigenous people of central New Mexico, that it is not really fit for civilized consumption. Now, you'll notice, I think, hopefully at least a few of you will notice how little the question of indigeneity features into this history of the medicalization of psychedelics and mysticism. So Ellis belongs to that aspect of things as well, borrowing from indigenous and in this case Native American sources, practices, and experiences, but doing so in a way that is meant to hold them at arm's length and to insist, as Ellis does there, that actually these substances probably are more enervating than they are enlivening, that they're ultimately not good for you, that they are exhausting. Now, a few years later, a slightly more positive note will be struck by William James, the godfather of empirical psychology, who in one of his late books, The Varieties of Religious Experience from 1905, reports on what it was like sitting in his office at Harvard and huffing nitrous oxide for a number of years, having far out wild mystical experiences, and wanting to develop a variety of methods for studying these altered states of consciousness. And for James, the stakes couldn't be higher. So long as these other states of consciousness escape our understanding, then we cannot assume that our default consciousness has anything like a valid objective understanding of the outside world. So altered states were really for him not just a kind of ancillary problem, but really the foundation and condition for the possibility of meaningful empirical psychological research. Now we'll jump ahead finally to Sigmund Freud, who, as I've already mentioned, was no friend to mysticism, though I think it's also fair to say that nobody, after William James perhaps, took mysticism more seriously as an object of psychoanalytic, scientific, and therapeutic investigation. So I'll point to just one example. This is from a late text from 1933, the essay on dreams and occultism from the New Introductory Lectures. And near the beginning of that text, Freud writes, mysticism, occultism. What is meant by these words? And just to underline, he is conflating mysticism with occultism here as though they're synonymous. He continues, you must not expect me to make any attempt at embracing this ill-circumscribed region with definitions. We all know in a general and an indefinite manner what the words imply to us. They refer to some sort of other world, using scare quotes even to hold it at further arm's length, lying beyond the bright world governed by relentless laws which has been constructed for us by science. So some sort of other world that is somehow not amenable, susceptible to, does not obey the relentless laws of science. It seems then that Freud is definitively kicking mysticism and with it occultism out of the pantheon of modern science in which he wants to include psychoanalysis. But then he goes a little bit further. He says, sooner or later, however, this disinclination must be overcome. We are faced by a question of fact. Is what the occultists tell us true or not? It must, after all, be possible to decide this by observation. Now here in this essay, Freud is most interested when he speaks of occultism in mediumship, spiritism, and telepathy, three of the most popular forms of quote unquote occultism at the moment that he's writing here. But it is throughout his works that he's interested in mysticism and magic as things that happen. What he's interested in doing, though, is figuring out scientifically some explanation for where these things that happen come from. And so he says, we shouldn't shy away from the mystical or the occult. We should be able to decide by observation, by scientific method, whether there is some truth, some validity to what the mystics and the occultists tell us. And yet, Freud says we reach another impasse in our attempt to do so. Here, he writes, unluckily, we are met by circumstances which are exceedingly unfavorable to our honest intentions. The observations on which our judgment is supposed to depend take place under conditions which make our sensory perceptions uncertain and which blunt our power of attention. I am imagining, what it's like to be in an altered state of consciousness, perhaps from some sort of drug inducement, not just in the middle of a medium's seance. These observations occur in darkness or in dim red light after long periods of expectation. We are told that, in fact, our unbelieving, that is to say, critical attitude, may prevent the expected phenomena from happening. The situation thus brought about is nothing less than a caricature of the circumstances in which we are usually accustomed to carry out scientific inquiries. So, can mysticism be scientific? Freud seems to say here, absolutely not. We'll return to and complicate this in just a moment. But first, we should ask, what does this mean for one of our initial questions? What is science? Now, Freud says, of course, yes, science is a method of inquiry, hypothesis, observation, results, hypothesis, experiment, observation, results, conclusion, something like that. It's been a while since I was in the fourth grade science fair at my elementary school. But more than this, Freud suggests here and throughout all of his works that science is an ethics of uncertainty, criticism, doubt, unbelief. An ethics of inquiry that valorizes and tracks, that chases after uncertainty and the unknown. So if mysticism requires our willing suspension of disbelief, which you may know is from Samuel Taylor Coleridge on the power of literary fiction, if mysticism requires our suspension of disbelief, it must be unscientific and therefore also very unpsychoanalytic. Now I'm going to jump further ahead in our story to just a few years after Freud's death, April 19th, 1943, Bicycle Day as it's now known, when Albert Hofmann, working for Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, first fully discovered the psychoactive effects of LSD-25. And fast forward from there, the discovery of LSD, the scientific psychopharmacological discovery of LSD, to the late 50s and early 1960s, with this group of upstart psychologists and psychotherapists working at Harvard University, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, who later became Baba Ram Dass. And they provide, I think, an essential example in this history of a counterpoint to Freud's dismissiveness, at least an attempt to produce a counterpoint to that dismissiveness. These eggheads in the 1950s and 1960s were themselves enamored with LSD and did a great deal of work on it, but a lot of their initial clinical work involved psilocybin. The story behind the discovery and patenting of psilocybin is its own important sidetrack to these events. So just to give you an example of what these guys were doing with the science of mysticism, with making mysticism itself into a scientific practice, I'll point us to a couple of examples from the archives. This is a brochure for one of the Castalia Foundation's experimental workshops. Leary, Alpert, and Metzner devised a series of pedagogical protocols for developing a kind of psychoactive, a psychedelic practice that through disciplined application and by following these protocols would allow one to ascend to higher and higher levels of understanding of altered consciousness, higher consciousness itself, expanded consciousness in the most expansive sense of that term. Now, just briefly to remind you that Freud says that mysticism and occultism refer to some sort of other world lying beyond the bright world governed by relentless laws which have been constructed for us by science. In this Castalia Foundation brochure, which I discovered in the archives at Harvard University one summer a couple of years ago, the text of this brochure begins as follows. In each generation, a small group of men stumble upon the riddle of consciousness and its solution. They discover once again that beyond the ordinary world of macroscopic, tangible, material things, there are endless levels of energy transformations accessible to consciousness. They learn again the age-old lesson taught by mystics and philosophers of East and West, that most of mankind is sleepwalking, moving somnambulistically through a world of rote perceptions. They learn that it is possible to come to awake, to be liberated from the prison of illusory perceptions and conflicting emotions. As have many internal explorers of the past, they become dedicated to the process of consciousness expansion, to the ideal of maximum awareness and internal freedom. Now, I don't know about you, but to my ears, this sounds like a kind of radical version of ego psychology. But they continue. The first step is the realization that there is more, that man's brain, his 13 billion celled computer, is capable of limitless new dimensions of awareness and knowledge. In short, that man does not use his head. So this is to say, using language like brain and computer, 13 billion cells, endless levels of energy transformation, moving somnambulistically. This is already a scientific language in which to understand and really to preach the possibility of mystical, psychedelically induced experience. In one of the later versions of these workshops, this one is called Psychedelic Sessions, and this one's pretty cool because it's been signed by Ralph Metzner from the mid-1960s, when already the Harvard eggheads had all lost their job and had gone sort of rogue, and when their place at the center of psychedelic counterculture meant that they were, sort of constantly on blast from law enforcement, and therefore under pressure to be careful not to, basically get in trouble for peddling drugs, even though these drugs were still more or less legal at the time. Well, anyway, at the beginning of this mid-1960s brochure, they write that during the fall-winter of 1965-66, a series of psychedelic group sessions will be conducted in these eastern Midwestern cities. Those are New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and so on. The aim is to produce a psychedelic or ecstatic experience without using drugs. The methods involve an intense 10-hour inundation of programmed stimuli, sensory, emotional, intellectual, artistic, philosophic, which reproduce and induce the LSD experience. In addition to the experience, and this is really the most important point for our purposes today, the session provides a living demonstration of methods for running sessions, of systematic techniques for recording and describing the psychedelic effect, as well as a survey and illustration of ancient and current theories of consciousness expansion. Elsewhere in another brochure, they will write, because of the complicated current legal situation in the United States, psychedelic drugs will not be used in these workshops. And that the schedule, I'm still quoting, for each weekend will provide for a balance between verbal and nonverbal, between the didactic seminar and the experimental laboratory. I'll just jump ahead to one more moment in this brochure in which they emphasize that this group has concentrated on designing language systems for receiving and communicating non-symbolic levels of energy and techniques for programming psychedelic sessions. So you can see that this really is a science of mysticism. And just in these few snippets, which do not tell the whole story, because the whole story would be a presentation in itself, the variety of methods and techniques that they develop, the pedagogical protocols that they outline here, really are meant to make mysticism into a discipline. Prior to their developing these pedagogical protocols, Leary et al. Were doing similar research, similar but very rudimentary compared to what we see among researchers today. So we're jumping all the way up into the 21st century with a brief detour through this 1961 questionnaire, the first of its kind, devised by Timothy Leary, the psilocybin research questionnaire. This one in particular is of interest because it was taken by Stephen I. Abrams, who was a graduate student at the time, but would grow up to be an important psychologist of paranormal and parapsychic activity. The real tip of the spear here in terms of the revitalization of this scientific interest in psychedelic-induced mysticism is a paper, a kind of groundbreaking paper published in 2006 by a group of researchers at Johns Hopkins University. You probably know that Johns Hopkins has really become one of just a couple of epicenters of leading psychedelic research. And here in this 2006 article, they argue that psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. And as they say in London, the article does what it says on the tin. Now, in order to demonstrate these outcomes, the question is, how do you measure mysticism? How do you develop a science of mysticism as an object of scientific inquiry? Well, and I'm grossly simplifying in the interest of time, these researchers used 3 different survey apparatuses with their collection of subjects. The first is called the hallucinogen rating scale. This is just a quote from that article. This consists of 6 subscales assessing various aspects of hallucinogen effects, intensity, soma aesthesia, affect, perception, cognition, and volition. The second, the APZ, which is my German is not great, but it is in German, the Altered States of Consciousness scale, which consists of 3 major scales in itself. The Oceanic Boundlessness scale, a state common to classic mystical experiences, including feelings of unity and transcendence of time and space. And you may recall that Freud takes aim at this oceanic feeling in the first pages of Civilization and its Discontents. The AIA, or dread of ego dissolution, dysphoric feelings similar to those of some bad trips. And the VUS, the visionary restructuralization, which includes items on visual pseudo-hallucinations, illusions, and synesthesia. And the mystical experience questionnaire, which is itself based on and the foundation for a few other variations that precede and follow it. It was, in this case, a list of 43 questions, simplified from the original 100-question Ponke-Richards mystical experience questionnaire, also known as the States of Consciousness questionnaire. It has since been revised down to merely 30 questions, the revised mystical experience questionnaire, and can be supplemented by, for example, other survey apparatuses, such as the Challenging Experience Questionnaire, that is how to do the science of bad trips, and the Persisting Effects Questionnaire, which is something that one takes at home. Here are a few examples of questions that the MEQ, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, asks. On a 6-point scale, subjects are asked to rate their experience of pure being and pure awareness beyond the world of sense impressions, their experience of oneness in relation to an inner world within. Speaking about this at another conference recently, some smartass in the audience asked if it was okay to rate oneness with a 6. An experience of unity with ultimate reality, and an experience of the insight that all is one. And as I say, these are just a few of the 30 questions asked on that apparatus. Now, I'm running quickly through all of this to emphasize that the science of mysticism, while having a long history, presents essentially two possible configurations of the question. The first is one according to which mysticism is an object of scientific observation. Mysticism is induced, or rather, something which is called mysticism is induced in a controlled laboratory environment, and then a survey which contains a series of questions that are meant to be aggregated in order to produce a total picture of that experience in these terms can be derived. So mysticism is something that science both invents and then wants to measure via its own apparatuses of measurement. Mysticism as an object outside of science. You have also mysticism as a branch of science, if you want, from those mid-century Harvard researchers who want to import scientific methods and rigors into mystical experience, or export mystical experience into a scientific domain, but ultimately science in many ways remains the vessel within which mysticism is contained. You could argue as well from another reading that mysticism becomes the vessel which contains science, but that raises more questions than it answers, which we'll get to in just a moment. And then finally, the question that I want to raise for us here, whether, if at all, it is possible to develop a different sort of relation, a non-hierarchical relation between science and mysticism, or what science calls mysticism. To conclude and to open up to some questions that you may have, and I can continue to ask questions of my own, I want to return to some of those framing questions from the beginning. Can mysticism itself be scientific, or is it only a possible object of scientific inquiry? The history of psychedelic science asks that question in a number of very practical and I think still relevant ways. Another question that it raises, though, this history raises, is when does science become its own kind of mysticism? That is the science of mysticism itself a mystification of scientific experience? Does it obscure rather than illuminate the experience it wants to measure, and then present that obscurity as an illumination, while it is in fact anything but? And what does psychoanalysis have to offer to psychedelic science today? Now, to provide my own brief answers to this last question, I would suggest first that psychoanalysis takes mystical experience seriously as an experience. As I said above, psychoanalysis is the science of subjectivity, the science of that which cannot be objectified the way a typical scientific object can be. It therefore does not operate in the domains of method and falsifiability that we normally recognize as scientific, but it operates more profoundly within an ethical domain of science as an inquiry into what we still do not understand. Second, and following from this, psychedelic science, as we have just seen, as well as the therapeutics it authorizes, and here I'm thinking of the use of MDMA for psychotherapeutic purposes, something which has been a subject of some tremendous controversy in the United States for the past couple of years, and much longer than that, of course. All of this is motivated by standardization in service to regulatory protocols. And again, there are good reasons for this. If you're going to be doing psychedelic science in a profoundly prohibitive environment, social and political environment, it's going to be necessary to toe the line and to present oneself as a serious scientific researcher who is not, say, unlike Leary and his pals in the 60s, getting high on one's own supply. And bringing all this together, that because psychoanalysis is the science of subjectivity, it does not, unlike psychedelic science, it does not try to cram psychedelics and psychedelic experience into measurement apparatuses that are constitutively ill-fitted to the phenomena in question. Historically, as we've seen, these apparatuses of measurement were designed only to understand these subjective phenomena and experiences objectively from the outside. If psychoanalysis is the science of subjectivity, then it wants to understand that experience immanently, what it means for a person, beyond and independent of any strategy or tool of objective measurement. Now, what else does psychoanalysis have to offer psychedelic science today? And what does psychedelic science or the psychedelic experience have to offer psychoanalysis that might loosen some of its anxiety about the possibility of that relationship? So, as I say, we've got about, I think, 10, 15 minutes at least. I've been speaking for some time now, so I would love to hear your thoughts, your questions, your objections, as you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Fantastic as ever. Um, I have some questions. Maybe I'll ask one first and then open it up. Um, well, I've actually got two. I'm deciding which one to ask. Maybe I'll go for this one that I thought of at the beginning, where you said the way in which Leary and Alpert and Metzner were thinking, particularly on that sort of pamphlet or journal, seemed to be a sort of radical extension of ego psychology. And I could sort of see where you were sort of pointing with that, but I was wondering if you could say a bit more about it.
Yeah, simply stated, and at its most basic, and this is an egregious simplification. I'm thinking of ego psychology as the therapeutic process by which formations in the unconscious are integrated into consciousness, which is supposed to subtract them of their disturbing effects, that it's sort of a cure through consciousness expansion in that sense. So to think with the Harvard eggheads about consciousness expansion in the radical way that they do, as a way of sort of breaking open the head, and also as a freedom of consciousness, which would be freedom from our somnambulism, a freedom from our rote and robotic belonging to a dead and deadening culture that is, I think, operating within a kind of ego-psychological paradigm. Elsewhere, someone like Leary will point out that there's, for instance, in Freud, much more to what he has to contribute than what he has been made into as a kind of caricature of the culture. And I think there is a much greater potential for the relation between these psychedelic scientists and psychoanalysis before ego psychology. But here, I think they're also trying to broker in the language of contemporary Western therapeutics in order to sort of seduce people into the more mystical Eastern spirituality that they find to be a kind of profound resonance with the psychedelic experiences they understand it. So I think it's sort of using ego psychology as a lure in that direction. These are, after all, advertisements for a movement. So they're trying to, I think, build bridges, and that's the language of the bridge they're building here.
That's very, very useful. Thank you very much. Has anybody else got something that they would like to bring in at this point?
Yes, please. That was really great, Nathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've got so many notes in front of me, and I feel quite fragmented. But I guess I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. And it's more of a, it sounds like there's a new language that's being developed where we're trying to extrapolate information that isn't something that isn't tangible to something that is tangible. And it kind of reminds me of, I can't remember the name of the book right now, but there was a paper that was talking about how writing is the oldest form of technology, where you kind of you present something that is in your head that is not, you're not able to kind of show people until you write it down, and that is a form of technology. And so I just want to kind of ask about your thoughts about quantum physics, because it reminded me so much of that when there was classic physics, it was kind of more tangible, it was valid, there was data, there was hard lines, something to present. But quantum physics is a bit more, I guess, mystical, where experiences or phenomena needs to be explained. But then when something becomes observed, I don't know if you know much about quantum physics, the phenomena collapses. And I don't know, I wonder if you have like a comment about quantum physics and if that kind of combines science and mysticism in some way.
Fabulous question. Thank you so much. Admittedly, my understanding of quantum physics is no greater than the quantum physicists themselves, who, in a lot of what they present to the public at least, admit pretty regularly that they don't understand what they themselves have discovered. So I will say that perhaps there is something mystical in that, if by mysticism we mean a kind of incommunicability, a kind of experience which is ineffable. And one of the measurements that these MEQs try to get at is the sort of being able to quantify ineffability at a subjective level. Now, I think quantum physics is attempting to understand something of the universe outside of the confines of the mind or of the human experience. And I'm sure that a great deal of good work is being done exploring the resonances between the quantum and the mystical in terms that you describe. I would say that as far as the sort of clinical or psychoanalytic question of the relevance of a potential mysticism in quantum physics is concerned, that I think there is a certain overlap with subjective experience, a kind of unbridgeable gap or disconnect between what it is to be a human person, what human being is, and how that humanity, how that personhood, how that being can be communicated to or with others. And I think at its most fundamental and at its most profound, psychoanalysis takes place in that gap, not in order to fill it, not in order to find words for what has yet to be named. Maybe to an extent that's the case, but really in order to kind of amplify the dissonance between the subjectivity of a human being and the world in which we live, and to raise a little more uncertainty, to break the chains of knowledge in the knowable. One comes to an analysis not in order to learn more about oneself, but in order to know less about oneself, to sort of break free from the confines of the stories that we've been telling about who we are, who we're supposed to be, where we're going, and so on. And so there is a kind of, there's a sort of, that can be its own altered state of consciousness, the experience of psychoanalysis, the experience of sort of rupturing with knowledge and entering into uncertainty. Now, as I say, whether that is, strictly speaking, consistent with or merely a kind of analogy to quantum physics is not something I'm prepared to speak to, but I think it's a brilliant question because it really forces us to consider the limits of materialism and materiality and objectivity, and how those limits are not the limits sort of science, but limits that science needs to be pushing up against. And this is, I think, something that Freud himself was already saying about always moving in the direction of the unknown and maybe even the unknowable. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask. Hi, thank you so much. That was also great. Also have lots of untidy notes here. And yeah, also a comment, I think, on what Keeks was talking about, which made me, obviously the first thought would be about Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle and things like that. And as you look at something, it changes the thing itself. And also connecting kind of mysticism to that experience, to quantum physics, is what they have outside CERN itself. They've got the Nataraj, which is the kind of sculpture of Shiva, the ultimate mystical character in some way, dancing outside the laboratory. My question is about your last slide, where you ask, the psychoanalysis should take psychedelic experience as an experience, or should take it seriously as an experience. And I think for me, the question has been always kind of, as what kind of experience does it take it? Because it's quite a complicated experience. And, is it I think in a previous session with the clinic, we've talked about it, similar to a dream experience, where I think like in one of those, where for Freud, the dream was the royal road to the unconscious. And this was like, I don't know, another road, like a scenic view or something to the unconscious. And what kind of experience does one take it as? Because it often arrives with its own certainties at the end of it. It's not as simple. It doesn't come open-ended sometimes like a dream does. It comes with like, now I know. Quite often it arrives in that way. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have something to say about that. Is what kind of experience does one take it as?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say, first of all, and I'm not saying anything I think I think everybody here already understands this, that a dream is not already thick with meaning. The meaning develops through the process of interpretation, the process of analysis, that by which the chains of association that connect the dream to a variety of other significances are sort of spun and unfolded. So a dream is, as I was saying in response to Keeks's remarks, one more opportunity to break with what I think I already know about myself. So if meaning is constructed through interpretation rather than discovered, as an archaeologist discovers a treasure in the bottom of a well or something, then I think a psychedelic experience, like any other experience, similarly can be made meaningful through the chains of association that it enables us to develop through the process of interpretation. Now, I think you're right. People will arrive perhaps and say, I've seen it, like I've seen the beating mother heart of the universe, and I understand all things now. Understanding and meaning are not the same. And meaning has to do, I think, in a psychoanalytic frame, with how this process of construction and interpretation can inform or transform the way one lives one's life. That's true of a dream. That's true of a traumatic experience. That's true of, I don't know, a hot air balloon ride. I mean, there are all sorts of different experiences that can have profound consequences for us. What psychoanalysis enables us to do is to provide a kind of framework within which to channel those experiences, not just inwardly toward our own sort of psychological transformation, but outwardly in the direction of how we can change the world around us, which has been built to our exclusion, how to make room in that world for what didn't exist before. So I think rather than having a kind of prescriptive attitude, rather than thinking of psychedelics as just one variation on a dangerous psychopharmacology, as though they're just another version of, say, antidepressants or other forms of pharmacology that sort of numb the subject and repress the unconscious, to think about psychedelics like drugs, alcohol of any kind, as part of the human experience. It's a very ancient, widespread, and profound part of the human experience. It means it needs to be taken as seriously as any other. Can it be a dream or like a dream? Yes. In the mid-60s, psychoanalytic psychedelics in clinical settings sometimes speaks or really writes about the trip as though it is a dream. And, maybe, I don't know. The question is, does the dream already sort of contain within itself, like the trip, the key to unlocking the secrets of the unconscious? Is that really what we're after? Unlocking secrets? Or is the trip, like the dream, say, a moment at which my sense of my understanding of the world and my place within it doesn't simply dissolve, but is jarred in such a way that its artificiality, its contingency becomes more apparent to me? Is it a way of sort of loosening my assumptions, my language-bound assumptions about who I am, about what the world is, about what we can be together? And can we work with that loosening? Or is it a kind of panacea and an end run around all of that work? And that, I think, is the kind of quick fix and very marketable version of things that psychoanalysis, as we all know, is already pretty resistant to, which is to its credit and also to its great detriment, as it is not so well fitted to this sort of mass production, mass consumption, uniform, standardized way of treating, let's call it, the difficulty of being human.
Thank you. Thanks. Tim?
I have a question that I think sort of follows on. And it comes from what you're saying in the talk about science and its relationship to mysticism and these different ways of conceiving it, all these possibilities. And obviously this distinction that you made, that we're talking about the sciences of the mind. And I just wondered, is there a way that there's a sort of conflation of different sciences happening in this way that you're putting it forward? For example, if we think of the sciences, the PSY sciences, and how people like Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen and a number of others would sort of distinguish these from, say, physics or chemistry, in the PSY sciences are actually studying artifacts that are produced by the very practice of study. This kind of they're observing the object is forming, and then they're acting as if the object already pre-exists the observation. Or would you argue that this is actually what is happening with all of the sciences, because of the nature of the symbolic and the construction of knowledge?
Well, the short answer is I would agree with the last part, that I think it's just, a matter of fact that a science has to construct its own object of inquiry in order to undertake the inquiry itself. So, this pen will be differently interesting as an object for a chemist than it will be for a physicist, say. Same object, very different questions, very different sciences are made possible by it. What kind of object is it? I think the question of conflating different sciences is exactly what I'm trying to get at when I'm suggesting that there is some sort of fundamental problem with the apparatus of observation and measurement when it comes to the I'll put it in scare quotes just provisionally, the scientific study of psychedelics and psychedelic-induced mystical experiences. And you see this in, for instance, the recent Food and Drug Administration's rejection of Lykos Pharmaceuticals' petition for essentially the legalization of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. They tried over a series of many years to build a body of evidence to appease the regulators that followed the set of protocols and standards of measurement that would be acceptable for any other, say, drug, like a painkiller or something that's supposed to, I don't know, help you with your allergies or something. But the problem was the Food and Drug Administration said that since these drugs, according to your own petition, only work as intended as an adjunct to psychotherapy, and since the FDA does not regulate psychotherapy, your petition has been rejected. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out. Dimitri Majanis and Ross Ellenhorn have written elegantly in a few different places about this, that the sort of compromising the singularity and specificity of both the therapeutic experience and the psychedelic experience in service to these regulatory protocols and expectations is a fool's errand, because there is something fundamentally immeasurable about this experience, and it's that immeasurability in which the importance of that experience resides. So if we're going to treat mystical experience the way physics treats gravity, the way chemistry treats, I don't know, chemicals, then we're going to misapprehend the object of our investigation from the very beginning, through the very processes of the investigation, according to the very assumptions upon which those processes are built. And that's the real challenge to the science of psychedelics, or the science of mysticism as I see it. And this is where I think psychoanalysis makes the most meaningful and important of its interventions, because it is a science, it's a kind of a scientificity without that scientific fundamentalism. It's a science of the immeasurable, a science of what cannot be objectified, what cannot be falsified. It is a profoundly rigorous but not standardized investigation into the limits and limitations of subjective experience and what can and cannot be communicated there. So this is a different notion of science that I think hopefully ruptures the sort of conflation that you're describing there. It's a way through that impasse. And this is why I think psychoanalysis really needs to be really at the forefront of this question of the emergence of psychedelic psychotherapy today. Whether psychoanalysis is or is not a therapy, it provides a kind of framework of, let's say, once again, an ethical framework in which to rethink this relation and to maybe reinvent what it can be.
It's very, very interesting. I suppose one thing that I maybe left out of the question is this thing that's so present in the history that you described, from mesmer to hypnosis to psychoanalysis, which is the transference. And of course, there is no transference of the object of chemistry to the chemist. But of course, the object of the sciences conforms to the expectations and demands of the psychoanalyst, or the experimenter. So, and that's my major criticism of psychoanalysis, actually. I think it really sort of gets to the core of what's going on, and leads us to a much more sort of literary kind of clinic. But I had one more sort of question or observation. Is it, in your thought, you're sort of constructing mysticism as the sort of object cause of desire of science, the object are this sort of remainder that falls away? Because in listening to that, I was thinking, we call it the object little a, because of how he wrote it. Like, this is how he calls it. This relationship to the other, that kind of stuff. But in that, it's very easy to sort of think about it as some very small, like, remainder, like that small bit that falls away. But actually, in this way, and sort of putting it with Leary and the others, that object ab becomes huge and expansive. The sort of frontier, the beyond the frontier to which science and, the sort of practice expands out into. Um, yeah, it just sort of seemed like a nice way of thinking about it, I thought.
I think that is a nice way of thinking about it. I would only add to that, as it's an interesting hypothesis that I would have to put a lot more thought into. But given the history that I'm charting here, I'm thinking of mysticism more as a kind of an essential kind of load-bearing pillar in the ideological edifice of modern science. So it is one very important object against which science opposes itself in order to define itself. And as I said early on, even by calling the vast range of profoundly distinct practices and experiences all one thing, mysticism, science is already operating its own kind of ideological mystification. But as you say, there is something, maybe to remain within the sort of Lacanian frame that you just introduced, there is something of the real at stake in an experience that no matter how much you talk about it or fail to talk about it, does not go away. Something that demands to be said, to be made meaningful, but that also refuses that saying and that meaning. And that is, again, why I think perhaps mysticism or psychedelic experience more generally can be a useful, let's say, agent in the development of a psychoanalytic sensibility, a Freudian or a Lacanian one, as can be the dream, for that matter, or the fantasy, or other forms of hallucination, non-specific mysticism, let's call them. But thank you for that remark about transference as well. I think you're absolutely right. What distinguishes psychoanalysis as a technique, as a practice, as an ethics is transference. And the question, what do we mean by transference, is a living controversy that I think is one way of distinguishing the multitude of different schools that call themselves psychoanalysis. I think it can come down to, what do any of these schools mean when they say transference? So just raising that question brings us really fundamentally to the problem of clinical practice and clinical technique, which I think is a great sort of bedrock always to return to.
I'll open it up for one more question if somebody's got anything pressing. Fantastic. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for coming. Really, we probably could have kept you here another hour, and hopefully we can have you back in the future.
I would be delighted. This has been a great experience for me. I really liked putting this work together for you and hearing your thoughts and engaging with you all. So best of luck with your ongoing and very important work across the pond. And yeah, I hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
All right.
Have a good day. See you later.